And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tana Vanderbilt to introduce our guest of honor for today.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Tana Vanderbilt. I'm General Counsel here at DDSN, and we are very pleased to be able to present our speaker today. I think he's probably the state's expert on the Freedom of Information Act, which he says he has been involved in since 1975. He is on staff at the University of South Carolina Law School and at the University of South Carolina School of Journalism, I believe, right? And he still does private practice law. So he's a very busy person, and we are very pleased that he could spend some time with us today. And I'd like to introduce Jay Bender.
Thank you, Tana. Good to be with you. Now, I must tell you, I'll give you a warning. I do have an endowed chair at the university. I am the Reed H. Montgomery Freedom of Information Chair. So I've done this stuff for a while. But what I'd hope to do is talk a little bit about why we have a Freedom of Information Act, how I believe it works. Now, let's make one thing clear. I am not your lawyer. I am not giving you legal advice. I'm giving you practical advice to deal with people who I represent, the news organizations of South Carolina. Tana is your lawyer. Now, I will also.
Not everybody's. Not everybody's. Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm trying to get you some clients here. Now, I will tell you that as a professor, I'm trained to talk for an hour and 15 minutes and then give an exam. So I hope you're ready. Now, turn off your cell phones. All of you. Turn off your cell phones. If your bookie's calling you, they'll leave a message. I just wish to hell I had bet that game last Saturday. I would have taken 17 points, and everybody knows Dabo has never beaten the line. He might beat the Gamecocks, but he's never beaten the line. So. Now, why do we have a Freedom of Information Act? I think the notion that we have one can be traced back to at least the colonial period. Now, I represented the Catawba Indian Nation from 1975 to 2006, and every time I got up to talk about the history of the Catawba Indian Nation and its relationship to the British and then the Americans, Gilbert Blue, the chief, always said, "You always start with 1640. I said, well, that's when it started. That's when you had your first treaty with the King of England. I won't go quite that far back, but how about the 1770s? What happened in 1776? The people who lived on this little sliver of the North American continent got tired of being under a monarchy, and they declared their independence. And while there are several lies in the Declaration of Independence, at least with respect to how it was exercised in 1776, all men are created equal, we know that was not the mode of operation in 1776, but the concept was the power to govern comes from the people. And that was carried forward after the Revolutionary War and after the Articles of Confederation proved to be inadequate for having a government in North America. We have a Constitution, and it starts out, "We the people of the United States," in order to form a more perfect union. So that's a direct contradiction of the notion of power in a monarchy, where the power for the monarch comes from God. The power in a democracy comes from the people. And we carried that forward in South Carolina. Article 1, Section 1 of the South Carolina Constitution says all political power is reserved to the people. I find it very troubling in our society that many people who are put in office to represent us somehow are confused. They think they are our masters, and they think they should control what we know and when we know it. School boards and cops are absolutely the worst. You notice in Chicago, there was a video released recently of a shooting of a young man. We have several such cases in South Carolina right now. There was a young man killed in a parking lot in a fast food joint in Seneca, and the police wouldn't release the video of that shooting until just recently, and wouldn't release the name of the police officer, saying he was a victim. Now, I don't understand how somebody who's on the operating end of a Glock 9mm is a victim when he shoots somebody who's sitting in his car in the back, but the police thought he was a victim. The there was a police officer in North Augusta who shot and killed a motorist, and that dashboard video has not been released. I filed suit on behalf of the Aiken Standard and some others to get access to that video. We'll see what happens. But probably the notion that the people who are our representatives are our masters comes from the political model that was in force when South Carolina was a colony. If any of you have had a chance to read Walter Edgar's excellent work, South Carolina History, you will know that South Carolina was different from the other East Coast colonies. The people who came to run the South Carolina colony, for the most part, came from Barbados, where they had been in charge of a majority enslaved population. And they came to South Carolina and they had that same political model. We had a thin veneer of white elites running a majority enslaved population, enslaved Africans for the most part, some of them were natives. That political model moved from the plantation to the mill village, and I think it's still the dominant political model in South Carolina, where we have people who believe that because they are in offices of responsibility and power, they have the power to tell us what to do. I think it's the other way around. I think we, as members of the public, should have the power to tell people in government what to do in our service. Like Tana said, I've been working with the Freedom of Information Act in litigation since 1975. It was passed initially in South Carolina in 1974. It's been amended several times since, and for much of the time between 1975 and 2006, I was a lobbyist for the Press Association and worked on most of those changes. It was the South Carolina Press Association that has taken the lead in trying to get a strengthened Freedom of Information Act. The General Assembly, when it passed this law in 1974, did something that it rarely does. It made a finding. If you look at federal legislation, Congress always has a record to say why it has done what it's done. Now, I realize, looking at the gray hair in the room, most of you recall when Congress actually did things. But when it was actually doing things, it would have a record that you could go to see why it did what it did. In South Carolina, we've never really done that. And you look at some of the recent legislation, you wonder what they have in mind, if anything at all. But when the General Assembly passed the Freedom of Information Act in 1974, it made a finding. And I think this is a crucial finding to give you a context for consideration of this law. The General Assembly finds that it is vital in a democratic society that public business be conducted in an open and public manner, so that the citizens shall be advised of the performance of public officials and of the decisions that are reached in public activity and in the formulation of public policy. Toward this end, provisions of this chapter must be construed so as to make it possible for citizens or their representatives to learn and report fully the activities of their public officials at a minimum cost or delay to the person seeking access to public documents or meetings. That's what the General Assembly has said this act is designed to do, and consistently the Supreme Court of South Carolina has interpreted the act to get to the end that there is no secret government activity in South Carolina except in those limited circumstances allowed by the law. The law is divided into three major parts. The first is definitional. The second deals with public records, and the third deals with meetings. And our focus today will be on meetings initially, but I'll be happy to talk about records questions during the question and answer period. The threshold question is, who is a public body? A public body in South Carolina is a political subdivision of the state, or an entity supported in whole or in part by public funds or expending public funds. I looked up the local DDSN board statute, and it says that these local boards are public entities. Well, that's not precisely the language of the Freedom of Information Act, which talks about public bodies, and the law applies to public bodies. But I think if you look at the funding mechanism for local boards and local activity, it's clear that just like the state board, local boards are public bodies subject to the Freedom of Information Act. The whole movement to get open government in the United States started at the end of World War II. During wartime, government secrecy was advisable, was practiced, but after the war, good government groups and press groups started pushing to make government more open. And many of the states that dealt with this dealt with it first in terms of records. And then others dealt with it in terms of meetings of public bodies. South Carolina, coming late to the game in 1974, had the ability to combine both records and meetings in one law. But the exemptions from public disclosure of records do not justify closed meetings, and vice versa. A justification for a meeting closed to the public does not justify withholding a record that might have been discussed at that meeting. These are to be interpreted separately. So let's start with the notion that each of you is in a public body. What does that then require you to do with respect to meetings? The law says that all meetings shall be public. Well, what about an executive session? Closed to the public. We'll talk about that in a minute, because there are some circumstances where you can meet behind closed doors for limited, articulated purposes. Give notice of your meetings. You have to give. I always thought there was a little inconsistency in the way the notice provision was drafted. And I will have to admit that in my lobbying effort, I probably contributed some to that ambiguity. The law says, I mean, not intentionally, I thought I was making it narrower and more difficult for a public body to convene a meeting without giving notice of what was going to be discussed. I've teased Joe Riley for years that the city of Charleston would send out an agenda for its city council meetings, and there would be nothing of any consequence on it that any citizen would want to discuss. So they would stay away in droves. And then they'd get in the meeting and somebody'd move to discuss the annexation of Savannah, and the agenda would be amended and they would discuss annexation of Savannah. That's, of course, why Joe has decided not to run for re-election, because Savannah decided it didn't want to be annexed by Charleston. What's a meeting? A meeting is the convening of a quorum of a public body. What's a quorum? Unless it's otherwise defined, it is 1/2. Now, in addition to political subdivisions being public bodies, committees of public bodies are public bodies. Whether you call it an advisory committee, a select committee, a blue ribbon committee, whatever it is, committee, subcommittee, advisory committee, regardless of what it is a public body subject to the same notice requirements as other public bodies. For example, the Board of Trustees of the University of South Carolina, meeting as a board, is clearly a public body, but it has subcommittees. And of course, the one that's on the mind of almost everybody at the university these days is the Intercollegiate Athletics Committee. Everybody wants to know why we paid Stevie Wonder $2 million when he quit in midstream. I have offered to not coach the University of South Carolina football team for years for a lot less money than Steve Spurrier is being paid to not coach. But the university has always wanted somebody with a national reputation that it could pay to not coach. So my reputation has nothing to do with football. So how do you give notice? two ways. At the first of each year, each public body must send out notice of its scheduled meetings, the date, time, place, and if there is an agenda for those meetings, that must be provided. And it must be provided certainly to people who have requested notice of meetings, and we'll talk about who can request notice and what your obligation is. But every organization that has a meeting has to send out a notice of its regularly scheduled meetings. Columbia City Council meets on Wednesday. So at the first of the year, it would have to send out a notice that it meets every Wednesday and that the dates and the times and the places of those meetings. I represent the Lugoff-Elgin Water Authority. The Board of Directors sends out a notice at the start of each year indicating that the meetings will be held on the first Thursday of each month, except where that first Thursday happens to fall in a holiday week, and then we'll give a different date. All news organizations, local news organizations, and anyone who requests notice is entitled to receive notice of all meetings, whether it's a regularly scheduled meeting, a special call meeting, an adjourned meeting, whatever it is. And notice has to be given as soon as practicable, but not less than 24 hours in advance of the meeting, unless it's an emergency. Emergency is not defined in the law. So what would an emergency be? An emergency to me would be something that can't wait 24 hours to be dealt with. The evacuation of Forest Acres on October the 4th. City Council probably didn't have time to give 24 hours notice to say the dams upstream on Jackson Gills Creek are exploding, we need to get people out of the way. So they could have that meeting, make that decision without giving notice. But if they want to talk about repairing the dams, then there's no emergency in repairing the dams. The dams are broken, the water's gone, the roads have collapsed. You give notice and you have a meeting. Well, what about agendas? I always thought that the law required an agenda because in one section in the law that deals with meetings and agendas, it said, and the notice provision is in section 30-4-80 of the South Carolina Code. There is a requirement that you post on a bulletin board or the door to the meeting place what your agenda is. This notice must include the agenda, date, time, and place of the meeting. This requirement does not apply to emergency meetings. Then there is a provision that local news organizations and anybody who's requested notice is to get notice that includes the agenda. And I always thought that that meant the agenda was fixed when you give your 24-hour advance notice of an agenda. But there was a case decided by the Supreme Court last year which said there's no agenda requirement at all. Now, I was not involved in that case. I'm disappointed I didn't have a chance to at least file an amicus brief. I didn't know it had been appealed to the Supreme Court. The plaintiff had won below and had won at the Court of Appeals. But the case went to the South Carolina Supreme Court, which said there is no agenda requirement in the law, reading only that section that says at the start of each calendar year, the notice must include the dates, times, and places of such meetings, agenda if any. Well, that was interpreted as meaning no agenda was required. The General Assembly was not entirely happy with that outcome because of my model of Joe Riley changing the agenda to discuss controversial topics. Now, to be fair to Joe, he didn't do that. I just like to pick on him. But it happens frequently that a public body will send out an agenda that is as innocuous as you can imagine, and then get in the meeting and bring up a motion to amend the agenda to add some controversial topic, and then it'll be acted on. And the General Assembly was aware of those circumstances and aware that that was anti-democratic. Why is this important? What's a democracy? Now, how many of you have had the opportunity on a Monday or Friday on an interstate near Columbia to see police cars from Goose Creek and Greenwood and Charleston and Greenville driving down the interstate in the left-hand lane in excess of the speed limit? Any of you ever seen that? Any of you ever seen a highway patrol car driving in the left-hand lane in excess of the speed limit? What's going on? Why are they doing that? And what's the consequence? I was invited to speak to highway patrol commanders a couple of years ago, and I started off by saying, how many of you drove here? Well, of course, they all did. Why else would you be in the highway patrol unless you like to drive? So they all drove there. I said, how many of you drove your patrol cars? And of course, they all raised their hand, because one of the benefits of being in the highway patrol is the troopers get to drive their cars all the time. That's why you will on occasion see a trooper's car going down the road with a wife and 3 kids on the way to the grocery store, because the trooper gets to drive the car home. I said, how many of you coming here today drove on I-20 or I-26? No, not you, the cops. Okay. So some of them did. I said, how many of you drove in the left-hand lane coming down here? And they started to figure that this was a trap, so half of them lied, but a few of them raised their hand and said, how many of you driving in the left lane were driving in excess of the speed limit to get here? And then they all lied, because you knew they were doing it. Why? Because they could get away with it. But what does that do to the credibility of the organization? Anything that keeps what you do out of public view erodes the confidence the public has in what you're doing. How can you perform effectively if your credibility is eroded because you're acting like a school board, doing things outside of public view? Now, school boards have a reason for doing it. Superintendents have a shelf life. And superintendents know that if the public knows what all's going on in a school district, the superintendent's job will be at risk. So the job of the superintendent, just like the job of the public relations person, is to keep bad news out of the public. And the school superintendent does it by having secret meetings. Well, what happens when people find out that there's been a secret meeting and a decision made that seems contrary to the public interest? A secret meeting to close a school. Can you imagine what the uproar in a community might be? Richland County went through a massive rezoning effort several years ago. Barbara Scott, who went on to be Richland County Clerk of Court, was the chair of the Richland 1 School Board trustees. And I went to lunch with her and I said, now, Barbara, here's what's going to happen if you do this in secret. There will be somebody on your board who will be unhappy that you have made the decision you have made. And that person is going to go out of the meeting and is going to tell the events from that person's perspective. And there will be people unhappy if you're going to close a school here, or you're going to shift the population from Lion Street Elementary to Brennan, whatever hot button issue there is. If you do it openly and let the public come in and watch how tough this decision is, they might not like it, but they will at least respect your decision. But if you do it behind closed doors, and this is before the internet, so this is before everybody could make nasty comments and get them published worldwide. So can you imagine what happens now when you have a secret meeting and a secret decision? Your credibility is gone instantly. Now, the Richland County Council is trying to counter this notion of free speech by gagging council members. They want to pass an ordinance in Richland County that says if you're a council member, you cannot discuss publicly what was discussed in an executive session. Well, apparently those people on Richland County Council have not looked at this document that I mentioned earlier that starts "We the People," because there is in there an amendment called the First Amendment, which says the federal government can't restrict speech and press. And after the Civil War, there's the 14th Amendment, which says no state can restrict speech and press. So a council member doesn't lose First Amendment rights just because they go into an executive session. So that should be a lesson to you when you go into executive session. You can't tell somebody not to talk about what's discussed in executive session. That's a prior restraint, and in my view, that would be clearly unconstitutional. Now, I know some of you are sitting here and saying, this guy's a lunatic. I mean, he thinks all government should be open. Now, Columbia's newest city council member, Howard Duvall, used to run the Municipal Association. And the Municipal Association, over the years, has made an effort to train newly elected council people. And it holds a series of seminars. And I used to be invited to give my FOI talk to these people. But Howard couldn't wait till after one meeting. He called me to share the evaluation that was done of my presentation. And obviously one of the council members had gotten there after the introductions had been made, because his review was, don't invite this guy back. He sounds like a newspaper lawyer. Well, I am, and that's my perspective here. My perspective is to put you in a position that the newspaper is not going to come after you for violating the law and thereby eroding your credibility, because your public service is generous, it's necessary, it's vital, but the only thing you have working for you is your credibility. And if you lose that, your public service will be discounted. So I think if you, and I've suggested to Tana that she tell you all about this document here. It's the Public Officials Guide to Compliance with the South Carolina Freedom of Information Act. It has the language, it's available on the South Carolina Press Association website at no charge. Now, if you guys have a big enough budget here, you can order copies that'll have a nice cover on it for $3 a piece. I do not get royalties from this. My contribution was the title. But if you look at it, at the beginning, there is a letter from Alan Wilson. And Alan is probably the fourth Attorney General of South Carolina to endorse this publication. And he gives these guidelines that his office uses. When in doubt, disclose requested information. When in doubt, post the time, place, and purpose of the meeting. When in doubt, open the meeting to the public. When in doubt, release the document. So the whole idea behind the Freedom of Information Act is to give the public an opportunity to participate. So you give notice of your meetings in advance. There's no reason not to. There's no reason to try to hide it. If there's a legitimate emergency, then you can act appropriately. But then I think you should, as soon as possible after that, disclose the minutes and maybe even a recording of that meeting. Now, some people will say, can you have a meeting by closed circuit television or by telephone? Yes, but you have to treat it like every other meeting. You have to give notice of it, and you have to have an opportunity for the public to attend. So that the Board of Trustees at the University of South Carolina over the years has held telephone meetings. And they do so by giving notice, and then they have a speakerphone in a conference room where the public can go to hear the discussion. Because the law says you can't have any chance meeting, social meeting, or use electronic means of communication to circumvent the law to act on any matter that you have authority over. So there was a school board down in Beaufort County that in the early days of the internet was just ecstatic because it could set up a password protected chat room and all the board members could go on there with the superintendent and they could make decisions and nobody would bother them about the decisions they were making because there was no unnecessary feedback from the public about what they were doing. And then when the Attorney General issued an opinion that said that was illegal, the superintendent sent out a real snarky email and said, well, we're going to have to stop doing this because the Attorney General says it's illegal. And then the Island Packet made an FOI request for all of the printouts from all of those chat rooms and for that email, and published it. So people will find out, and people will find out in a manner that will put you in the worst possible light. So there's no reason to not have an agenda. The law gives you some cover legally to have a meeting where you change the agenda to add something, but why would you do that if you knew in advance that that was going to come up? It's like the sign, you might have seen it down at the highway department. It said, procrastination on your part does not necessarily constitute an emergency on mine. So if you know it's going to happen, why don't you disclose it? Now, how about going into executive session? That's a meeting that can be closed to the public. All meetings have to be convened in public. They cannot be convened in executive session because to go into an executive session requires a motion, a vote, and a statement of specific purpose. And we'll take these elements one at a time. How many of you have ever been to a meeting where somebody said, we're going into executive session for contractual matters? Raise your hand. Okay. And those others of you have never been to a meeting then, because that happens every time. How many of you have been to a meeting? We're going into executive session for personnel matters. All right. The word personnel does not appear in that section in the law. These people make this stuff up as they go along. If they would read the law, and I encourage each of you to read the law just to have some feel for it, and it's not entirely easy. I assign this to my undergraduates to read, and being that they're undergraduates, they probably read the first section and get the name of the title, get the act title down, and then it's just too difficult. They don't go beyond that. But I always give a pop quiz on the Freedom of Information Act and ask questions just because I believe it's important, because some of them are going to end up being public relations people for public bodies, and they need to know these things. Some of you may have heard of a fellow named Jim Holderman. He used to be president of the University of South Carolina. When Anwar Sadat was assassinated, his widow, Jihan, was hired to teach a course on the role of women in the Middle East at the University of South Carolina. And an enterprising young journalism student named Paul Perkins thought that was terrific. He thought that would put Carolina on the world stage, and he was writing an article about it. And like all good reporters, he wanted to know how much it was going to cost. And he asked the university how much Jihan Sadat was being paid, and the university wouldn't tell him. And what the university didn't understand is Paul was married to a very able lawyer named Cheryl Perkins. And Cheryl had read the Freedom of Information Act, as had Paul, and they filed suit against the university. Well, my law partner at the time, Gene Toll, who's gone on to find other work, and I had breakfast with Holderman and his provost and his public relations vice president, and we said, you have to give this information up. It might be a 2-day story if you give it up. If you don't give it up, you have no idea where it's going to end. Well, I could not possibly have imagined that it would end with him losing his job and going to federal prison twice, but that happened. I'm not suggesting that that's the consequence for all of your violations of the Freedom of Information Act, but it started down a slope all because of a desire to keep information away from the public. And when you have a meeting closed to the public, or where you take up a matter that is not previously disclosed, the public will be distrustful and in some instances may even file suit. So how do you go into executive session? You have a motion. I move we go into executive session. If the vote is positive, then the chair must announce the specific purpose. Nothing illustrates deficiency in South Carolina education more than the inability of people in public positions to understand the difference between generic and specific. And the Supreme Court has waded in on this, saying we're going into executive session to discuss contract matters is not specific. And number one, it's not even what the law says. The law says you can go into executive session to discuss negotiations incident to a proposed contract or the proposed sale or purchase of land. If you have the other side in that negotiation in that room, there is no reason to have an executive session. You can go in to discuss negotiations incident to that proposed contract, but not negotiate the contract. Why do we need secrecy there? Well, we might want to pay $150,000 for this piece of property, and they're asking $300,000 for it. And we're not going to go in with our first offer at $150,000, so we go into executive session. We say, we'd like to have it. We could pay an amount, but why don't we go back and offer $100,000 and see what happens? So then you come out of executive session into open session. The motion is to authorize the agent of the body to make an offer to the seller at the level discussed in executive session. That way you haven't given away your hand and you have the ability to enter into those negotiations. There's legitimate need for confidentiality there. This notion of personnel matters. The law says you may have a meeting closed to the public to discuss employment, promotion, demotion, or discipline of an employee. That doesn't mean you can go into executive session to discuss your budget for next year with respect to employee pay raises. You can discuss the promotion of an individual and how much you're going to pay that individual. When the Board of Trustees gets Ray Tanner's recommendation, they can go into the board members can go into executive session to discuss, do we want this guy and are we willing to pay him $2 million a year? And he better win more than 9 games. I mean, that's the threshold now, apparently.
That's the negotiation.
Well, I mean, we would have killed to get 9 wins this year, and in Georgia they're firing the guy for it. I mean, I spent my Army tour as an assistant athletic trainer at West Point, and I worked my way through Carolina taping ankles. And even though that paid my way through college and kept me out of Vietnam, I believe we've put way, way, way too much emphasis on 18, 19, and 20-year-old boys in pads running up and down the field with an odd-shaped leather ball. And to pay a guy $2 million who quit in mid-year just astounds me. I asked my students what they would think if I quit in mid-semester, and they said they'd be happy. But they offered to take up a collection, but I didn't think they could get to $2 million. Read the law. There is no contractual matter executive session purpose. It is discuss negotiations incident to a proposed contract. It is discuss employment, promotion, or discipline of an employee and other listed items there. How specific do you have to be? Tan and I talked about this before. The Supreme Court has tossed a big old fish on the table here by saying that what a council did in saying it was going into executive session to discuss negotiations incident to a contract was not specific enough. I think you now have to say we're going into executive session to discuss negotiations incident to a proposed contract for the purchase of property. I don't think you have to disclose what property that is. I think you can say we're going into executive session to discuss discipline of an employee, and the law says clearly you don't have to name that employee. I think when you come out, you take a vote, and you do not necessarily have to disclose the piece of property you're negotiating to buy, and you may not have to disclose the person you're going to discipline. But I will tell you that the records you have of that discipline will be public records. There is no exemption for personnel matters from employee records, even though almost every agency in the state believes there is one. I tried a case some years ago. It's called Burton versus York Sheriff. where the sheriff disciplined deputies and then didn't want to provide access to records of that discipline. And the trial court and the Court of Appeals said, no, those records are public. There is no unreasonable invasion of personal privacy with respect to the performance of your public position. Now, school boards get confused about that all the time. They want to evaluate superintendents in secret, and superintendents like that because they don't want any bad news to emerge about them. But read the law. Don't go into executive session improperly. Don't do what a group did the other day. It wanted to avoid having to give notice of its gatherings. A school board lawyer once called those meetings for which no notice was given an unannounced assemblage. Well, if it's a quorum, it's a meeting. And if you divide up into committees, and the Darlington School District did this one time, it was going to discuss its budget, but it didn't want to discuss it in public. So it had two groups. It had one group that was going to meet one night in Hartsville and one group that was going to meet the next night in Darlington. And it said, we didn't have any meetings. I said, yes, you did. You had two of them. And the judge agreed with me. I said, you had two committees appointed because people didn't show up by happenstance. You decided who was going to be in Hartsville and you decided who was going to be in Darlington. Those were committees. And those meetings had to be preceded by notice, had to be open to the public, and you had to take minutes. The minutes of I think you have to take minutes of executive sessions. That has not been litigated, but I think if you look at the minutes section, it suggests that there have to be minutes. Otherwise, where's the institutional record of what was discussed in executive session? I don't think you have to disclose those minutes, but I think you have to keep them. You do have to keep and disclose minutes of your regular open meetings. When I say regular, all open meetings. And those minutes have to be made available when someone comes to your place of business without having to submit a written request, and they have to be made available for the preceding 6 months. Well, city and county attorneys always have heartburn over this. Well, they're not minutes until they're approved. No, that's nonsense. They're minutes when they're drafted, and if that bothers you, buy a rubber stamp down at Smith Stamp Company that says draft, not yet approved by council, and disclose those to the public, because the public might disagree with your take on what actually happened at the meeting. Now, there's been a lot of discussion lately about Richland County Council members wanting to have votes on the record so that you know who voted which way on which item. And I've tried to suggest to the people that seem to be all up in arms about this that the law already provides for that. The law says in the minutes that if any member of the body requests, all votes by members must be identified by member. So if you have a board that takes a vote and somebody's on the minority and wants the names of everybody who voted on the other side, all that person has to do is say, all right, let's record the votes by member in our minutes. And Ned Sloan will file suit over that sometime. Ned, as you may know, is a very wealthy retired highway contractor who is as committed to open government as anybody who has ever lived in South Carolina. And he has put his money where his mouth is. And he has sued everybody from the Hundley Commission to the Tax Commission over secret government activity. I think he should be given a Medal of Freedom, but he's not popular in some places. Glenn McConnell took the job at the College of Charleston so he wouldn't have to deal with Ned Sloan and his pet project, the Hundley. I've heard they wanted to start a football team at the College of Charleston, but they couldn't figure out how to make the uniforms look like Civil War uniforms, so they've abandoned the idea. All right. So that's what I think about meetings. And I think you jeopardize your credibility and the credibility of your body by violating the law, and there may be lawsuits when you do things illegally, by not giving notice, by using an improper purpose for an executive session. The Sumter County Council years ago held a meeting and approved a business license tax ordinance without giving notice to the public. Well, some people were unhappy about that. They filed suit. The trial court set aside the ordinance and ordered the repayment of all fees collected plus interest. The courts have that sort of power in granting equitable relief. A water district in the upstate, in Cowart, had an illegal meeting to provide a golden parachute to its executive director. The members had recently lost an election and they knew they weren't going to be there, and this was their guy and they wanted to protect him, so they went into executive session and approved a very attractive buyout proposal, or a buyout plan that would have to be implemented when the new board came in. And when the court found out that it had been done in secret, it set it aside. So there can be consequences. Now, there is a criminal penalty provision in the law. I think it's absolutely worthless. There's been one case since 1974 where there was a prosecution of people who very clearly violated the law. They held a meeting without announcing it to the public and fired the fire chief in a fire district in the upstate. Their defense was, we didn't know we were violating the law. And since the prosecution requires a willful violation of the law, the judge says that means not only did you have to act knowing you were going to act, you had to know your act was a violation of the law. I'm not sure that's what willful means, but you prosecute these things in magistrate's court because they're misdemeanors, and the Supreme Court has said we can't have private prosecution, so the solicitor has to prosecute these cases. Well, solicitors figure they have a lot bigger fish to fry than prosecuting people who violated the Freedom of Information Act. I've suggested to the General Assembly that it just eliminate that provision. No reason to have it. It's not going to work. Nobody's afraid of it. What are your thoughts? Anybody have questions? Nobody will admit ever going into executive session illegally in here, I know. I'll turn around and look the other way if that'll help you. Be candid.
Well, back to the issue of the agenda. You started talking about the one, you have to basically give notice of the all
Right.
year-long meetings and
Right.
like that, but each individual meeting is gonna have a separate agenda.
That's right.
Yeah. So
And
that's
if you-
post the 24 hours
Yes,
beforehand, right?
that's right. And if you have an agenda, you have to post it.
Right.
If you have a set agenda at the first of the year, you have to disclose that too. Now, the law does allow an amendment of an agenda, but it requires a supermajority vote. And it has to be done in a limited set of circumstances, basically emergencies. That you can't routinely amend the agenda to add an item, and if you're going to take a final action on the item, you can't amend the agenda to add that item unless you have a supermajority and articulate in the record why it is an emergency that you have to act that day. The far better practice is to set your agenda before you go into the meeting and keep to that agenda. Zoning boards sometimes do this. Can you ever drop an item from an agenda? Sure. And you can do that without notice, I think, and that only inconveniences the people who have shown up for that particular purpose. But you thwart the whole purpose of the act if you add items for discussion and action without disclosing it to the public. And this new agenda amendment, which was Senate Bill 11 that passed last year, says that if it is an action, if the body can take action on it, it has to do, let's see if I can find it here quickly. Once an agenda for a regular call, special, or rescheduled meeting is posted pursuant to this subsection, no items may be added to the agenda without an additional 24 hours notice to the public, which must be made in the same manner as the original posting. After the meeting begins, an item upon which action can be taken only may be added to the agenda by a 2/3 vote of the members present and voting. However, if the item is one upon which final action can be taken at the meeting, or if public notice, taken at the meeting, or if the item is one in which there has not been and will not be an opportunity for public comment with prior public notice given in accordance with this section, it only may be added to the agenda by a 2/3 vote of the members present and voting, and upon a finding by the body that an emergency or an exigent circumstance exists if the item is not added to the agenda. So nothing herein relieves a public body of any notice requirement with regard to any statutorily required public hearing. For example, public bodies are required to hold public hearings before adopting a budget. A zoning board is required to hold a public hearing on a request for a variance or something like that. But why jeopardize your credibility by adding an item to the agenda just because you didn't want any public feedback in advance of the meetings? I'm always amazed that people who hold public office feel put upon when people express their views about some action that the public body is contemplating or has taken. Nobody is serving involuntarily here. This is not 1962. Your Uncle Sam is not calling you to say, "Here, boy, I have a pair of boots and an M1 rifle for you." We're here because we're volunteers in service to our community, and part of that service is responding to public input on those matters that are important to the public. And it's the public that gets to decide what's important, not you. All right, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Getting back to the executive session, I always thought that, just like it says, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Basically, what happened in the executive session stayed in the executive session. But you were saying that members of the executive session can go out and say what they want to say about what happened in the executive session?
Sure.
There's no confining them to the secrecy of that?
Then what's the purpose of executive session then?
Well, the purpose of executive session is to have the discussion closed to the public. But I don't think there's anything in this law that restricts a member coming out to discuss what happened in that meeting. And I think any effort to impose a restriction would be a prior restraint, which could be sustained only if the public body could demonstrate that there was a compelling governmental need for the secrecy, that the only way to protect that compelling governmental interest was this gag order, and that the gag order would be effective, and that it was the least restrictive alternative. Look at it this way. If it's not constitutional to restrict the publication of the Pentagon Papers, what is it that county council is going to be talking about that comes anywhere close to that threshold?
We'll take your example of the contract for sell for land. Okay, they say we're gonna, only off 100,000, whatever.
Right.
Okay, they come out, they say, yes, we're gonna, make an offer, we're gonna, negotiate whatever, make an offer. Well, then the person goes out, leaves executive session, goes to the other person, says, oh, by the way, they're only offering you 100,000, but really they may go up to 300.
Sure. Well,
Then,
we know in South Carolina that the guy going out to make that call is calling his cousin. I think every time a new school gets located that you should do a property search to find out which relative of the school board member owns the adjoining property. Not the property being sold, they're too slick to do that. You want to know who's going to have the real estate development next to the new high school. That's where the cousins come in. Yeah, there is no, a lawyer could be disciplined if you were acting as a lawyer and did that, because a lawyer acting within the scope of the attorney-client privilege has an obligation imposed by law not to disclose client confidences.
Right.
A member of city council has no similar obligation.
but then again, I don't see the purpose of having an executive session.
Well, Fred Shaheen, some of you have probably known who Fred is. He was a newspaper editor and for years was executive director of the Higher Education Commission and was chairman of that commission for years. Told me that when he was chair, they never had an executive session. And they discussed the replacement of Holderman at the university. They discussed the integration of the universities in South Carolina. They discussed moving a PhD program to South Carolina State. I think there are far too many executive sessions. But the majority of time, people going into executive session will be on board with the need for confidentiality in there. And they will operate probably in good faith to protect the confidentiality of what is said. But I don't think you can impose any legal constraint on that person or restraint on that person to keep them from disclosing what was said in executive session. The school board lawyers all say, oh, it's a violation of the code of ethics. Oh yeah, show me where that is. I've never seen a code of ethics for school board members.
Has that ever been tried?
Nope. I mean,
He'd be glad to.
I'd be happy to represent. There was a fella down in I think in Batesburg, and I think it's Batesburg or Bamberg, and there's been some question about where he actually lives. And he got, Steve Kane's his name, and he got tossed off of whatever council he was on, and now he's been reelected. The people decided he lived where they wanted him to live, and so he's been reelected. So they're not trying to kick him off anymore. I always thought that Steve might be the first guy that somebody would try to sue for disclosing something in executive session. We have an interesting case in South Carolina called Bellamy versus Brown. It's probably a case that gives you great comfort if you release information about discipline of an employee. The South Carolina I'll give you the facts of the case. An employee of a county was terminated, and the county administrator issued a press release saying why this person had been fired. And the person filed suit against Brown, the county administrator, saying that this is information of a personal nature which should not have been released. It could have been sheltered under the FOIA. You had no basis on which to release it. And the Supreme Court upheld a trial court decision that said, no, we don't have a Privacy Act in South Carolina. We have a Disclosure Act. And even though there are exemptions from disclosure, they are not to be enforced. The discretion to withhold something from the public in a record is up to the public body. I think if you take Bellamy v. Brown and couple it with the First and 14th Amendment, the government would have a very difficult time punishing somebody for disclosing what was discussed in executive session. So, yes?
I might regret asking this question, but...
Wait a minute. I always tell my students, the only regret you should have is not asking a question you have.
Okay, this is the question.
All right,
You
now,
talked about
let me call a timeout here. I'm going to pick this up. I did screw the top back on, but I hope it stays on. Now, if I get down here and can't get back up, I will acknowledge being an old fart. I could have gotten down there. There is no question about that. I'm not sure I could have gotten back up in time for this session to conclude today. All right, let me have your question.
All right, you talked about going into an executive session and some of the proper terminology that you might use. You're in executive session and you come out of that executive session. What is proper terminology to be used?
Well, let's back up one thing first. When you're in executive session, your discussion has to be restricted to those things that you identified going in. People go into executive session and they get off track and they start talking about anything. You have to have some discipline when you're in there. Then there would be a motion to return to open session or a motion to adjourn the meeting altogether. Those are the only two motions that can be made in executive session. You cannot take a vote in executive session. You cannot poll in executive session to find out what the sense of the body will be when you come out. You can only have the discussion. Now, it's quite common for people to, if you're in favor of this, scratch your left ear, and they're all in there doing this because they don't have the courage to come out and take the vote in public. They want to know what it's going to be before they come out. You can't do that. That's illegal. And if somebody's unhappy about what's been done, that'll come out. So you come out into open session, then there may be a motion. I move we offer the price discussed in executive session for the purchase of a piece of property under consideration. If that gets a second, then you have a vote. I don't find anything in the law that says you have to come out and say nothing happened. You can only come out and say this is what, this is the motion, and this is what we decide, because you have to make all those decisions in open session. That help? That answer your question? Do you have any regrets? Okay, I told you you wouldn't. All right, who else? There had to be more than one person with courage in here. Okay.
So, Jay, you're suggesting that in executive session that minutes be taken?
Yes.
So then, someone can send a FOIA request for those
But
minutes?
those minutes are exempt. I'll practice law here for you today. Now, you'll have to ask your lawyer, but here's my interpretation of that.
And while you're looking that up, you can lawyer me on the part about, would the members of the body have an opportunity to approve, amend, correct that set of minutes?
When you have the next meeting, but I think that when you draft them, as soon as they're drafted, they become a public record.
This is an executive session.
Okay, well then, sure, you can circulate them, but here's, see if I can find it here. All right, section 30-4-90A, all public bodies shall keep written minutes of all their public meetings, and the law says all meetings are public, so I think that means all minutes. Such minutes shall include, but need not be limited to, the date, time, and place of the meeting, the members of the public body recorded as either present or absent, the substance of all matters proposed, discussed, or decided, and at the request of any member, a record by an individual member of any votes taken. That's why I can't understand why Richland County Council is troubled by how you get record voted. You just put it in the minutes. And then any other information any member of the public body requests to be included. Then the minutes shall be public records and shall be available within a reasonable time after the meeting, except where such disclosures would be inconsistent with section 30-4-70, which is the executive session provision. 30-4- let's see what that is.
Yeah, it's a meeting, yeah, which
Yeah.
means closed, yeah.
Yep, 30-4-70, meetings may be closed. So I think you have to keep minutes of executive session, but you don't disclose them because that would be inconsistent with 30-4-70.
Well, then
If
you
I'm
have,
a member in that body in the executive session, and I now have minutes from that executive session, but I can't be gagged to the confidentiality, what's to prevent me from giving those minutes to someone else?
Nothing.
then how do you circulate them? And then, normally when you come back into the next meeting, you approve the minutes.
Sure.
But
How
you
do you
can't
do
take
that if it's from
action.
executive session?
Well,
You have to
I-
go into executive session to approve the minutes from the
Well,
last executive session?
I think
But
what you would do is,
can't take an action in session.
this is not that hard. This is not that hard. You go into executive session to discuss the minutes that were taken in the last executive session, and then you come back out, and the motion would be approve the minutes as drafted, second, vote on it, or approve the minutes with the amendment discussed in executive session, vote on it. Now, this has never come up because votes have now been prohibited in executive session. Before 1987, I think it is, you could vote in executive session. And if you didn't have minutes of the executive session, how did you know what the vote was? You would end up like a certain school district over in Sumter County at one time where there appeared to have been an action in executive session to give the superintendent a pay raise. And that was recorded in minutes that had been prepared of that meeting. But the irony was the typewriter that was used to insert that provision in those minutes was not purchased by the district until 2 years after that meeting was supposed to have taken place. So, chicanery runs rampant, and our goal is to prevent it by putting a little light on what's going on. All right, other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm not real clear as to who still, this applies, public meetings or public entities. And I understand like a nonprofit that gets some of their funding through some governmental source,
Sure.
whether it be state or local, would be subject. But what if you join a coalition or an association of similar bodies, and so your dues go to pay, if there are dues?
You
There may not be.
paying dues out of your pocket, or you paying dues out of public money?
If you're paying dues out of public money, there's another association that may not pay dues at all.
How about
If
this?
the dues
Let's-
pays nothing.
Let's use the one association that everybody in South Carolina pays attention to more than any other, and that's the High School Athletic League. All right? Who gets to be a member of the High School Athletic League? Not Hammond, not Heathwood, not the private schools. The public schools are the members of this league. How are the league fees paid? From public money. And for a long time, that group thought that it was a private nonprofit until it got sued, and the trial court ruled that it was a public body. It had to hold its meetings open to the public. There is litigation now against chambers of commerce that get millions of dollars a year in hospitality tax funds to promote tourism activity. And these chambers want to pretend they're private organizations and that they don't have to account to the public how that money is being spent. I think that is quite similar to the case against the university. It was Weston versus Carolina Research and Development Foundation that was the end result after Paul Perkins got the ball rolling. The Research and Development Foundation at Carolina got 10% of every grant given to any professor at the university, even though it did nothing. These people were trained in Las Vegas. They knew what the skim was, and they skimmed 10% off of every grant. The Wade Hampton Hotel, which used to be on Gervais Street across from the State House, corner of Gervais and Assembly, was purchased by the university and used as a dorm. And then some people wanted to buy it. And the first contract was, and I'll just use imaginary numbers here, the first contract was $10 million to sell this building. Well, the contract was revised. The purchase price suddenly became $5 million with a $5 million contribution to the Research and Development Foundation. The engineering building down on Assembly Street got a $16 million grant from the federal government to add an additional floor. That was when you could have earmarks, and Fritz Hollings was the senator and he believed in earmarks, so he got $16 million to the university to put another floor on the building. And then there was some small amount of money given by Richland and Lexington County to landscape the Coliseum. When the trial court looked at those, it said this is a private nonprofit corporation, but it is a public body under South Carolina law because it is funded by public money and it's spending public money. What would be a distinction? You contract for the purchase of paper towels for your restroom, probably, all right? And I don't know who, let's make up a company. Dixie Paper, all right? You have a contract, you buy this from Dixie Paper. You're buying it with public money doesn't make Dixie Paper a public body. But the Columbia Museum of Art gets about $400,000 a year in public money from Richland County and the city of Columbia. To me, that makes that a public body. And when that board tried to hire a new director in secret, the lawsuit came to the same result, that it's a public body.
So it's not a matter of paying dues, the scenario that you were saying. If the membership consists of staff of public, as defined public entities, then that would be a public entity.
Well, it's the money coming into it from public sources that makes it a public body.
Okay.
So if there's no money going in, if it's a loose-knit association.
Yeah. Now, if there are no dues by using public money to pay the dues, no problem.
What if the vehicle and that's used by the person to attend the meeting is paid for with public funds,
And
and
then
the
they're on
salary
public
of the
time.
person attending?
Well, the question is,
Public time.
the question is, what does it mean to be supported in whole or in part by public funds? You driving the car there would probably mean that you are being supported by public funds, not necessarily the organization. In this research and development case, The executive director of the foundation was a university vice president whose salary was paid by the university. The office space was provided by the university. All the administrative staff was paid for by the university. So it's very clear that it was supported by public money.
Okay, then if we could go just a little, another direction with this. We have committees that are representative, they're groups of volunteers, human rights committees that review various things that, are you familiar with human rights committees that review?
I've heard of them in the UN. I didn't know we had them locally.
But-
I've seen no evidence in South Carolina.
Okay. So the human rights committees for individuals with disabilities, we have outside people who are volunteers come in and review any types of programs or procedures that might be termed restrictive, especially for individuals who don't really understand what their rights are. Now, those meetings, I would not think they would be subject, just like staff meetings.
You've already told me, well, we'll get to staff meetings in a minute. You've already told me that it's a committee. Is it a committee of your board?
No,
Yeah,
it's
I
not,
was about to
there are no board members, there are no board members.
No, not of your board. Is it a committee appointed by your board?
No.
Where do these people come from then?
The staff,
But who do they volunteer to?
staff ask them to volunteer.
They volunteer to the local boards.
One of the things that's different, the purpose of this committee is to review health protected information of vulnerable adults.
Sure.
So you've got HIPAA, so you couldn't have that meeting generally being open to the public because you are discussing health specific information to Johnny, Susie, and Bobby. So I mean, it's a completely different scenario.
I would think that the meeting has to be noticed and the meeting has to be convened in public, but your discussion would be in executive session.
But,
I mean-
well, no, because they're not transacting business of the body. They are transacting business concerning one consumer, one individual we
Sure,
serve.
but what are they doing with the result?
They're working with that individual.
All right,
Meeting
but
some
the-
kind of-
We're making a recommendation.
To whom?
A recommendation to staff
All right,
To the staff of
that may or may not be binding.
all right.
Because it's a recommendation is the way the wording of that committee language is. They
Like, we
make
think
a
the
recommendation,
person
right?
has been
Because
fully
I know of
informed.
times
All right.
where.
Here's a case here's a case I think that answers that question perhaps. Quality towing versus City of Myrtle Beach. Myrtle Beach decided to adopt an ordinance and select one tow truck company to tow abandoned vehicles, vehicles where people had been arrested for DUI or had been in a wreck and had to go off in an ambulance or something. Requests for proposals were sent out. Several tow truck companies responded that they wanted to be the operator because before Myrtle Beach had been rotating among all of the licensed tow truck operators in town. And the city manager identified 2 employees to review the request for proposal and make a recommendation. That recommendation was adverse to Quality Towing. Quality Towing filed suit and said you violated the Freedom of Information Act because these 2 guys meeting to make this recommendation did so without meeting in public, without giving notice, without keeping minutes. And much to my great astonishment, the Supreme Court agreed that those 2 guys meeting to make a recommendation to the city manager, which went to the city council, was a public body under the act, under the definition of a public body. I'll read the last part of it. It follows, supported in whole or in part by public funds or expending public funds, including committees, subcommittees, advisory committees, and the like of any such body by whatever name known.
You see, but I don't think they're not expending funds, they're not expending.
But they're appointed by a body for a purpose. They're giving advice.
It's statutory committee, again, to look at, I'm trying to think of another one, I can't think of one that's analogous to it, but that they're looking at basically this person to see whether or not any human rights or that
Sure.
person's rights are being violated by perhaps more restrictive,
Sure.
say you can't go out this weekend or you can't do things
Right.
like that or something like that. I don't think that's expending public funds.
No, no,
so, yeah.
I don't think that's the question. I think that it is a committee of a particular local board, or maybe of the whole organization, I don't know, and its purpose is to make an inquiry and then make a recommendation. I think that makes it a committee of that local board, without respect to whether it's expending money. Do I think those meetings have to be public? No. But I think they have to be noticed and they have to be held open to the public. Will anybody attend? No. I mean, but don't do it like the Ports Authority. The Ports Authority always thought it was sufficient to give notice by putting the notice of the meeting on a door of a room to which the public did not have access.
And then staff.
Let's get back to basics. As a local board, how are we to make our board meeting? We'll do 10, 12 meetings a year. We know the schedule, we send that notice out to our board members, but where do we go after we go to board members? I mean, do we put it in the paper?
Well, you have to put it on.
Send it to the media in January that the commission meets on the third Thursday of every month with the date. Normally it's at
Is that
10.
required?
Yeah.
But you have to send it to all the media or only upon request?
Well, no, all local news media.
It's in the law,
Yeah.
all local news.
Yeah,
We don't do
yeah. Wait. And you have to post it on the bulletin board at the place of the meeting. And a lot of people post it, and if you don't have a bulletin board, a lot of people post it on the door of the office and the door of the place that you're going to meet if it's a separate place.
Now, 24 hours in advance, we do post an agenda, but we have not been sending that to the media when we do our monthly notification that we will meet. So the agenda.
Well, I think the law requires you to send the agenda too.
Send the agenda as well.
Right.
It can't say agenda available upon request
Well,
or.
it says send it, so, it says give it, so.
Well, what DDSN does is maintains a list of interested parties.
Sure.
And anybody who requests to be on that list, and anybody can be added to that list, they will automatically get the notification of the meeting. That includes the agenda. If for some reason the agenda is amended way before the 24-hour notice, an updated agenda still gets sent out to all of the interested parties.
I think that's a great way to do it.
Most of the boards, the local providers, you have a set day of the month and usually a time. So if you did a notice to your local media and your interested party folks that says on the third Monday, the first Tuesday, usually at this time with the dates, and send that out in January, you can include a statement that says that other agendas and information will be sent monthly. That way, it informs that party, this is the general plan, but we will keep you updated and the public and interested parties informed as we go through time.
I think that's a great way to do it. The General Assembly is very good at giving notice. We can pick on them for a lot of things, but let's say you're interested in a bill that's before the House Judiciary Committee. You pick up the phone and call the Secretary of the Judiciary Committee and say, I'm interested in House Bill 3420. Would you please send me notice when it comes up on an agenda? And you'll get a notice of an agenda. And it'll be before Con Law Subcommittee on Tuesday, an hour and a half after adjournment, or 3 o'clock, whichever comes first, or however they phrase it. And you'll have notice and you can go to that meeting, you can participate. And that's the whole purpose of this, to make government open and people supported by government money, public money, to give an opportunity to find out what your money's going for and what the people in office are doing. Yes, sir.
Staff meetings was the other part of that. Do those have to go out to?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Unless the staff is doing something like those two guys in Myrtle Beach were doing, making a recommendation that was going to city council that'd be voted on by council. Typically, you're just dealing with the day-to-day business.
Okay, so it's
But-
staff-based, but human rights.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'll ask a question, I think I know the answer,
Well, then why are you bothering me?
but we serve multiple.
You're like my
counties.
students.
Yeah. We serve multiple counties,
Right.
so you're saying that I should post our meetings, make notice of our meetings in every county
Sure.
that we serve.
Sure. I mean, to the populations you serve. And, you know, find out who, and I don't know what counties you're in, but I suspect each of those counties has at least one weekly newspaper, maybe more. You probably have radio stations that may even do news.
That might be pushing.
Well, there's some that still do news.
We are rural.
Well, send them all notice and let them know what you're up to. Why wouldn't you, would be my question. So, inconvenient, right? Well, democracy is inconvenient as hell. Yes?
So our board has several committees. So based on what I'm hearing, you would also send to the media the agendas for those committees?
Yes. For each committee meeting.
Okay. And then one of those committees that meet has to do with quality assurance and where our board members review any allegation of abuse, critical incidents, death. And then we bring, the committee meets as a whole, and they look at each individual that was involved. And then we bring it to our full board at the board meeting, but we go into executive session with an attorney present to discuss that. Are we doing it right?
I think so. I think so. Again, because the executive session, if I can get back to it here very quickly. All right, you can have a session closed to the public for discussion of employment, appointment, compensation, promotion, demotion, discipline, or release of an employee, a student, or a person regulated by a public body. And I would think your client might fall within the regulated, and certainly employees about whom complaints are made are within the ambit of that. And I think you could have that discussion closed to the public. You could also, if that involved potential criminal conduct, you could have a meeting closed to the public to discuss investigative proceedings regarding allegations of criminal conduct. So I think that, but you have to start in an open session. You have to have a motion, a vote, and the statement of specific purpose. And you can't take any action in executive session. You have to come back in public.
Along those same lines, when a board goes into executive session, as far as other members that aren't of the board, like for example, staff that need to either brief or participate in the discussion with that governing body, is there any limitations on that as far as being?
Who could be in there?
Correct.
No, I think, where I think there's a problem is if you go into this, discuss negotiations incident to a proposed contract, and you have the other side in there, there's no need for confidentiality. But I think the body would be entitled to have whoever it needs for support in that meeting. Yes, sir.
The minutes, we look at different providers, different boards, the board of directors minutes. Some of the minutes they take copious notes. There'll be 3-4 pages. Some of them may be 3/4 of a page. Could you tell us what would be better for our folks to do? Or what would a person be looking for there?
Well, I think you'd have to look, the thing to do is to look at the law, 30-4-90, and that sets out what must be in the meeting, in the minutes. And as long as you satisfy that, here's where people may be more expansive in what they put in the minutes. The substance of all matters proposed, discussed, or decided. How far do you have to go to discuss the substance of what was proposed? So some people can probably do it in a sentence. If they're college professors, it'll take them an hour and a half. What else you got?
I want to make sure we get the opportunity in TV land. Does anybody, well,
they're formulating their questions.
yeah, Kevin in the back, but next we'll go to TV land, so wave your hands wildly or something in a minute.
So simple majority, FOIA defines the simple majority as a quorum.
That's correct.
Can an entity choose to define a quorum because it gives the option that is less than a simple majority? Like if they're having problems with board members showing up and they have 9 members and the simple majority is 5, where they say, no, our quorum is 3.
Well, I think there are two ways to look at it. You'll have to look at your organizational statute to see if there's any requirement for what a quorum is. But I don't see any, and the reason you have to look at that is who has enough authority to act for the body. If you reduce the quorum size, then you have a rump diet. But in terms of the Freedom of Information Act, you can define the quorum as being 2 out of 3 or 2 out of 6, say, and that would be a meeting. Now, whether that would be legal within your organizational statute, I don't know. But in terms of the FOI, you could certainly reduce the number required for a quorum. Most people would probably want to go the other way so they don't have to report anything.
Well, that was my interpretation was, okay, it can be simple majority, but we want to have at least 75% of our body there to show that we're, but then we see sometimes people go the other way.
Sure.
I get worried when, only a third constitutes a quorum and they're making decisions.
Well, that's right, and that's where the problem's going to come in with the legality of what's been decided.
Are there any questions out in TV land? Everybody's good in TV land?
Well, these were such great questions in here.
And I'm not cutting this short,
they
I
didn't-
just didn't want to leave the guys in TV land out of the equation.
They all appear awake.
Okay, we'll continue with questions in this room then.
And if the thought moves any of you out there, do the same, ask questions. All right, other questions? All right, well, then I'll move adjournment. Pleasure being with you.
Thank you very much for your time.
It was my pleasure.